Good afternoon. Thanks for coming to my presentation on design pattern libraries. My name is John Goff, and for the next 20 minutes, I'll be talking about design pattern libraries and what makes a good design pattern. And I'll be showing some examples of pattern libraries that I like. I think that the previous two presenters is a good segue into design pattern libraries because we're talking a lot about all of these elements that we're trying to capture and to create consistency, whether it's in content or whether it's in building responsive sites. Just a quick disclaimer here that this is just for presentation purposes. The fine folks at eBay Legal made me throw this slide in there. So, hello. Just a little bit more about myself. Again, my name is John Goff. I've been working for eBay for about the last 9 years. I started at eBay Motors. I worked for PayPal for a little while. And for the last few years, I've been working on Magento. So I'm working on the next version of Magento, which is very exciting. And I'm pretty stoked about it. I got started in web design over 15 years ago, back before the words user experience were even being used. I think my first job title was a web designer, and my boss was like the webmaster, and that was pretty much it. So I'm just going to be sharing my experiences with design patterns, and I'm not going to be talking much about technology or making any platform recommendations when it comes to pattern libraries. I figure you guys know what's best for your organization. But I'll be showing some examples of these libraries that I think work well. What I will be talking about is really more about consistency and workflow formatting. What makes a good pattern? How much is too much? How much is too little? I think these things are quite important when it comes to building out a pattern framework. So let's start by defining what a pattern is. A pattern is a reusable solution to a commonly occurring problem. This is true in software development. We're not changing that definition for design. I think that designers can learn a lot from engineering as far as how to create a consistent workflow and consistency across a user experience. But we use a lot of terms, right? I mean, we throw a lot of words around as designers. A lot of engineers do this too. So I think it's just important to kind of set this up and really understand what we're talking about when we mention a pattern library. It's really an organized system for referencing and managing design patterns. You see here's a little bit interchangeability between pattern library and front-end framework, but a front-end framework is really a set of coded CSS, HTML, and JavaScript components that you can usually demonstrate inside of a browser window. And then, of course, as designers, we're familiar with style guides. I think in an ideal world, there's no reason why all three of these concepts shouldn't exist in the same space. So, one of the first pattern libraries that I was exposed to was Yahoo's design pattern library. I think, this is going back, I don't know when I first saw this. It might have been like 2004 or something like that. But I think it's a good example. It's sort of a tried and true example of a system that does a good job of just defining design reasoning for patterns that are found across the Yahoo user experience. And so I think it's a solid example when we start talking about a design pattern library. In terms of front-end frameworks, a lot of you are very familiar with this. Bootstrap is what I would consider to be a pretty solid front-end framework. But I stopped short of calling it a pattern library just because it doesn't really go into a lot of that design reasoning explanation, instruction on how to use, when to use. Certainly there's room to do that within the Bootstrap framework, but really I think a lot of folks use Bootstrap to demonstrate components in a browser window, and I think it's very good for that. And maybe this is all you need, but I think that there's something to be said for explaining your design and creating some standards around that. And of course, style guides. This ties into our brands, and I think that style guide information certainly has a place within a pattern library system. Obviously, we're talking about colors, and we get into specifics on what kind of style we're going to be using. So I think that's just as important. So this isn't the first time that humans have designed with patterns. I think there's this notion that early humans really they derived a lot of inspiration from nature. We could probably get into a lot of esoteric reasons why things that follow a certain geometry are considered beautiful. But if we look at patterns like the golden ratio and the rule of thirds, I think that these rules are still true today, just as they were 1,000 years ago. And so we see these patterns evolve through history, and we still use those patterns to establish what is a good composition in art history, in art, for example. So we continue to use these concepts like the rule of thirds to establish what a good composition is. And that's important. This is a book that's a pretty good book I would recommend by VINH, Ordering Disorder, Grid Principles for Web Design, where he really talks about establishing a page grid based on the golden ratio and the rule of thirds. And I think that this is a really positive move for designers today. When I started in design, in web design, these kinds of principles weren't really being talked about. The web was this new frontier. It was this new format that we felt like we could do anything with. And that's just, I think that we failed a lot in the early days. And now we're kind of, turning back to our roots, these concepts that typesetters have used for a very long time that have worked very well. So why should we throw that out the window? We shouldn't. We should continue to use these principles. And this book is really good about describing them. Of course, in computer software history, the first GUI environments were developed in the 70s and 80s through patterns like the MVC. In the mid-90s, about the time that I was just learning about HTML, engineers were thinking about patterns for object-oriented software. The legendary Gang of Four at Xerox PARC created guidelines that carry through today in web application design. And I think designers can learn a lot from that, right? It's this notion of reusable code, reusable components. Why shouldn't that apply to a lot of our design concepts? So why do you need it? Just a quick show of hands. I'm assuming that everybody in here, or a lot of folks in here, identify with the label designer. Can I see a show of hands of designers in the room? And then how many people identify with the title the developer or engineer? Okay, a few more engineers than I would expect. Maybe that's an unfair it's an unfair question because a lot of people wear multiple hats, right? But usually I think people identify with one or the other, right? That's not a bad thing. If you can do both, great. But I think it's always better if you can play off of, if I'm a designer, I'm playing off of somebody who's more of an engineer thinker and vice versa. So traditionally, what I've seen as being the problem is that we have the designer and we have the developer, right? And there's usually this gap. And really, pattern libraries are all about bridging the gap. And there needs to be a gap between the E and the G there, but my bad. I'm not following my patterns. So, problem. I think somebody asked the question earlier, there was some question about, at what point do you hand off the PSD or the design spec to the engineer? I mean, this is the real issue here is, as designers, usually we're working on some kind of mock-up or a comp that we're handing off to a development team. And somewhere along the way, sometimes things get lost in that transition, right? We all know that problem. And then, depending on the size of your organization, you might have a lot of different touch points with your design, right? I mean, when I was at PayPal, we had over 300 people in the design organization. They weren't all designers. Some of them were content writers. We had, we had product owners, visual designers. I mean, and of course, if you're in a smaller organization, maybe you're wearing a lot of these hats. If we're on the Star Trek Enterprise, then these guys in red don't do too well, and you're just left with the designer and the developer. I'm glad that there were like Trekkies in the audience, because that joke did not go over well with the South by Southwest crowd. I don't know. Anyway. So, who is the pattern library for? It's for everyone. Yeah, because I mean, really what we're talking about here is a system that everybody can point to and look at for what the spec is supposed to be, and there's a clear understanding. We're all on the same page with these systems. So when do you start building your pattern library? By the time you start, usually it's too late. You've already got something. Maybe you don't have a pattern library. You've already released. Maybe you've had several releases, and you need to do some audit to just get started on this pattern library, and it's maybe it's not worth it, but it really is worth it. The good news is that there's really never a bad time to start. And what we're talking about here is consistency, right? It's all about consistency, the conformity and the application of something, typically that which is necessary for the sake of logic, accuracy, or fairness. And so I mentioned, working together, working collaboratively a little bit. And a lot of times we find ourselves, as designers, we'll find ourselves sort of working on this island. We come up with a proposal. We review that proposal with our peers. There's products involved. Our other designers are involved, and we collect that feedback, and then we go back to our island, and we work on the next version of that proposal. But really, I mean, if there's any opportunity for us to get together with engineers, I think we should, right? I mean, ultimately, we stand to gain so much from this knowledge transfer that takes place. I'm always really interested in understanding more about, what's going on with engineering, and then I find that engineers are equally interested in understanding more about our design process. So, as much as we can kind of work together, I think that that's important. The developers bring tools and the development environment to the table, and designers bring the research and the design to the table. And then we can create a demo together. That's the really cool part about it. So what goes into a pattern library? And so the way that I kind of present this usually is I like to think of pattern library assets as Legos, and the patterns are really the instruction sets to putting the Legos together. Without instructions, things can get out of control quickly. We need to be communicating our designs to engineers, and sometimes if we can imagine it like this: if we're given a box with hundreds of Legos with no instructions, it'll take us a while to put that together. And I think that these patterns really allow us to document this in a meaningful way. So really, instructions make all the difference when building a project. The right amount of detail in the instruction is certainly a factor when it comes to how quickly that project is completed. So format. This is all up to you, but there's no need to reinvent the wheel here when you start putting together your pattern documentation. We're really just talking about some basic concepts here. An earlier example of this, which is still completely valid today, is Wiley.com. which is, the material is definitely dated. You'll see that if you go to the site, and some of you are probably familiar with this. But this format is pretty tried and true, right? I mean, problem, solution, when to use, how, whatnot. Collaborate with your engineers and your organization to find out what format makes the most sense. But you really need to think about how much is too much, because as designers, we get carried away sometimes with, putting way too much detail into the mix. And really what we're trying to do here is eliminate this, this hard copy spec mentality where we think we have to define everything up front. I mean, I think that part of having this iterative process is creating this demo and working together in a true agile fashion, and not worrying too much about all those little details. There will be room for that later. But it's important, especially if you have a larger organization, to establish sort of a governance model that's going to keep your pattern library in check. This is one of the things that I proposed for PayPal when I was working on the PayPal pattern library. Things really generally start with the design teams, and it was important for us to establish this cross-functional team that served as a pattern review board of sorts. Usually the way that it works is designers in the organization come up with a proposal, and this review board would be responsible for vetting that proposal. Maybe there's already a working, there's a solution already available in the system, and we don't need this proposal. Or if this proposal works, then we run it through and we deliver it to a team that works on it and creates a component for it. But there's always this system of kind of just checking things and keeping a finger on the pulse of the patterns in the system. And then these draft articles and patterns get added to this design pattern library. This is really a content management system that we're talking about here. And again, the governance oversight here is responsible for checking the progress of the draft and reviewing the demo. And then this is usually drawn up as a final pattern, a final article, and worked into a release made public in the system. So really, when it comes to governance, though, there's no right answer. But it's up to your organization. You just have to really think about what makes the most sense. I'm just showing you what we proposed at PayPal. So we've talked a lot about structure and patterns and all that and governance, but let's see some examples of some pattern libraries, right? And we already saw this one, but I just wanted to mention it again because I think it's a pretty solid example of a pattern library that has some good documentation to it. Maybe a little verbose. Where it kind of misses the mark, I think, is in doing the actual demonstration of the component in the browser. This is a little dated. The eBay pattern library is actually publicly available. You can go to the URL to see it. I think it's well organized. And it's one of the few systems that succeeds with providing this, this clickable demo of the pattern in the browser window, which is kind of cool. You kind of have to drill into one of the patterns and then click on a tab to actually see that. But check out the eBay pattern library. I think it's still a valid system. MailChimp, I think, has a really good pattern library. They really set a new bar for creating a simple and easy to understand pattern library. They just get straight to the point, and I like that. Patternry is this is like a community-driven pattern library. You can submit your patterns. I think this is a good place to go for inspiration for creating new solutions for problems. So when I was doing my research on pattern libraries, I discovered this Salesforce pattern library, which I think hits the sweet spot. It's a long URL, but if you can check that out, you should. They do a really good job of combining the style guide and the components, and then the actual design reasoning and everything. So it's just a really nice, centralized kind of system that I think works really well. A list apart, they published this, I don't know, about 6 months ago or so. And again, it's a little light on the details. It's more of a, I think it probably falls more into the front-end framework category, but yeah, I think that they're going to improve on this quite a bit. Of course, I mentioned Bootstrap, front-end framework. Another one is Foundation. This is like being touted by Luke W. and a lot of other movers and shakers in the UX world. And I think it follows a lot of the same principles of the Bootstrap framework as well. But at the end of the day, these are examples that give us inspiration. And really, I think it's just important to build this. If you've been thinking about it, you just got to go for it. I kind of lied in the beginning about recommending a platform. If you're really in a rush to get things started, really all we're talking about here is a CMS. Use a platform that makes sense for your organization. But WordPress and Drupal seem well suited for this kind of a job. And if you're looking at WordPress, there's actually a WordPress extension called Pairs, which is actually it's geared for pairing patterns and components, front-end components. So out of the box WordPress extension that caters to this functionality is pretty cool, in my opinion.